few months ago, I started working for a local courier company to earn some extra money. Deliveries usually went smoothly until one peculiar day. I was assigned to deliver a small, neatly wrapped package to an apartment building in an old part of town. When I reached the address, the building seemed deserted, with peeling paint and broken windows. I knocked on the door of the specified apartment. An elderly woman with a distant look in her eyes answered. "Delivery for Mrs. Harper?" I asked, holding out the package. "That's me," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. She took the package and thanked me with a weak smile. Something about her made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as just an old woman's frailty. The next day, I was back on my route when my boss called. "You need to go back to that apartment. The woman who expected the delivery just called and asked why we were late. Go back and fix the mistake." I drove back to the building and went up to the apartment. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Finally, a neighbor opened their door and looked at me with a confused expression. "Can I help you?" the neighbor asked. "I'm looking for Mrs. Harper. I delivered a package to her yesterday, but there was a mix-up," I explained. The neighbor's face went pale. "Mrs. Harper and her husband have been dead for years. No one lives there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But I handed her a package yesterday. She took it." The neighbor shook her head. "I found that package outside their door this morning. I was going to bring it back to the delivery company. There's no one living there. Hasn't been for a long time." I retrieved the package from the neighbor, my hands shaking. When I returned it to the office, no one wanted to open it. Eventually, my boss decided to send it back to the sender, but the address on the package didn't exist. The whole incident was quietly swept under the rug, but I couldn't stop thinking about what might have been in that package. To this day, I still have nightmares about that eerie delivery. Back when I was in college, I worked at a local pizzeria to help cover my expenses. Most nights were pretty routine, just delivering pizzas around town. But there was one night that still haunts me. It was a Friday night, and I had a late delivery to a secluded area on the outskirts of town. The address was a bit sketchy, but I didn't think much of it. I grabbed the pizza and drove out there. The house was isolated, with no other buildings in sight. The whole place had an eerie vibe. I rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, a young woman opened the door. She looked pale and wore a thin red nightgown that didn't leave much to the imagination. She smiled at me, but there was something unsettling about her. "Hey there, thanks for the pizza," she said in a soft voice. "I want to give you a tip. Come inside." My boss had always advised us not to enter anyone's house, but I was shy and inexperienced. I didn't want to seem rude. So I stepped inside. She led me down a dark corridor to the kitchen. The house was dimly lit, and everything felt off. "Have a seat," she said, pointing to a chair. "I'll get my purse." She winked at me before leaving the room. I sat down, feeling uneasy. The kitchen was cold, and I noticed the windows were covered with heavy curtains. After a few minutes, my discomfort grew. I decided to leave. I stood up and walked back to the door, but my heart sank when I saw a huge man standing there. He wore dirty clothes and smelled terrible. He just stood there, blocking my way, smiling with his yellow, deformed teeth. I froze, not knowing what to do. My mind raced. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. The woman was back, holding her purse. She let out a strange whistle, and the huge man turned and ran towards her like an obedient dog. "This is my little brother," she said, smiling at me. "He looks a little strange, but he's very nice." She asked if I wanted to share the pizza with them. In that moment, adrenaline kicked in. I didn't care about the pizza or the tip. I bolted for the door, pushed past the man, and ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine and speed away. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the pizzeria. I told my boss what happened, and he was shocked. He said he would look into it, but I never heard anything more about that delivery. I quit a few weeks later. That incident made me realize how dangerous some situations can be. To this day, I can't forget the look of that woman and her little brother. I had been delivering packages for a few years and had seen my fair share of odd deliveries, but nothing prepared me for what happened one cold winter night. It was late, and I had one last delivery to make. The address was in a rural area, quite a drive from the city. As I navigated through the snow-covered roads, I finally reached a small, isolated house at the end of a long driveway. The house looked old and worn down, but I thought nothing of it. I knocked on the door, and a young woman answered. She looked pale and seemed distressed. I handed her the package, and she thanked me with a shaky voice. Driving back, I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The next day, I checked my delivery log and saw that the package was scheduled for a different address, one that was much closer to the city. I mentioned it to my supervisor, who told me to go back and correct the mistake. I drove back to the rural area, but when I reached the location, the house was gone. There was no sign of any structure ever being there. I was confused and called my supervisor, who insisted I must be at the wrong spot. I searched the entire area, but there was nothing. I asked around the nearby houses, but no one had ever seen a house there. I reported the incident, and the package was marked as undeliverable. I tried to forget about it, but I still can't explain what happened to that house or the woman I delivered to. It's as if they vanished into thin air. It was a rainy evening, and I was finishing up my deliveries for the day. I had one last stop at a high-rise apartment building downtown. The package was just an envelope, but it felt unusually thick. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor and found the apartment. A man in his 30s answered the door. He looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. I handed him the envelope, and he gave me a hurried thank you before shutting the door. As I walked back to the elevator, I heard a loud crash from the apartment. I turned back and saw the door slightly open. I hesitated, then decided to check if everything was okay. I pushed the door open and called out, but there was no response. Inside, the apartment was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered everywhere. I found the man lying on the floor, unconscious. The envelope was torn open, but it was empty. I called 911 and waited for help to arrive. The police arrived and started their investigation. They asked me a lot of questions, but I had no answers. The man was taken to the hospital, and I was left with an uneasy feeling. The next day, I found out from the news that the man had died in the hospital. The cause of death was undetermined, but there were rumors about him being involved in some shady dealings. I couldn't stop thinking about that empty envelope and what it might have contained. A few weeks later, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm and collected. "Forget about the envelope," it said, "for your own good." The line went dead before I could respond. I reported the call to my supervisor, but nothing came of it. To this day, I have no idea what was in that envelope or why it was so important. All I know is that delivery changed my life forever, and I still get chills thinking about it.